It's a pleasure for me to introduce this morning's plenary speaker, Professor Catherine Clifford. She is a professor here at the Faculty of Theology of St. Paul University since 2002 and is currently the Vice Dean as well as Director of the Research Center, Vatican II and 21st Century Catholicism. After an initial honors bachelor degree in religious studies at the University of Waterloo, Professor Clifford earned a graduate certificate in ecumenical studies at the Institut Œcuménique de Beausset in Switzerland, a licentiate in theology at the Université de Fribourg in Switzerland, and a PhD at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. Her doctoral thesis, published in 2005, is entitled The Groupe des Dômes, A Dialogue of Conversion. In the succeeding years, Professor Clifford has focused her research in ecclesiology, especially the study of the Second Vatican Council and ecumenism. Together with Professor Michael Attridge of the University of St. Michael's College and Professor Gilles Routier of Université Laval, she organized 3 conferences in 2009 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the calling of the Second Vatican Council. The papers read at these conferences were published in a collective work entitled Vatican II, Expérience canadienne, Canadian Experiences. Among her many works is a volume co-authored with Professor Richard Gallarde entitled Keys to Vatican II, Unlocking the Teaching of the Council, published this year with Liturgical Press, as well as 25 Questions sur le Pape, co-authored with Francis Morrissey and Pierre Urtubise. Professor Clifford's paper today is entitled Learning from the Council, A Church in Dialogue, in which she will explore how the experience of the Council has influenced our way of being church, our ecclesiology, and our proclaiming the gospel today. So without further ado, I invite Professor Clifford.
Thank you. In the history of Catholic ecclesiology, the Second Vatican Council represents a rediscovery of the value of what we call conciliarity, or the dynamic of synodality in the Church. In this paper, I propose to explore an important aspect of this rediscovery by examining the culture of dialogue as it was experienced in the event of the Council itself. In recent years, this phrase, culture of dialogue, has been used with particular reference to the Church's engagement in interreligious dialogue and in dialogue with secular society. I would apply it here in a much broader sense, extending it to the dynamics of life within the Church and between Christian churches as well. The term dialogue, in this sense of a broader culture of engagement, emerges in the experience and the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. The Jesuit historian John O'Malley has suggested that if we're to arrive at an adequate understanding of the Council and its documents, we must appreciate the extent to which the dynamics of dialogical engagement are deliberately inscribed in its mode of teaching and in its conception of the life and mission of the Church. I propose to examine the coming to awareness of the priority of dialogue in the history of the Council itself, and by looking at the interventions of protagonists who helped to orient the course of Vatican II and give a basic coherence to its teaching. This priority is reflected in the engaging style of the Council texts themselves and in their frequent appeals to dialogue, both within the Church and with others. On this 50th anniversary of the opening of Vatican II, I will consider the importance of continuing to nourish that culture of dialogue in the Catholic Church today. But first, a brief word about councils in the life of the Church. To fully appreciate the role of dialogue in the experience and teaching of Vatican II, it's worth recalling the role of a council in the life of a church as an opportunity for dialogue, an exchange which permits a spirit-guided discernment of the gospel. What we see in the privileged moment of an ecumenical council is a concentrated expression of the dynamic set of relationships that should characterize our living together as church at all times. The 2,600 bishops gathered in Rome over the 4-year period from 1962 to 1965 were themselves deeply marked by their own experience of dialogue and became convinced of its importance for the very form and content of the Church's teaching. Their experience was one of deepening awareness of the Church as a communion of all the baptized, whose inner vitality and outreach are contingent upon the synergetic cooperation of all as we place our gifts at the service of God's Spirit. Without true dialogue, the creative dynamism of that communion is at risk. Throughout the history of Christianity, church leaders have gathered in council whenever they deemed it necessary to deliberate and take decisions on momentous matters of concern to the church. An ecumenical council is a gathering of the bishops of all the local churches. Its ecumenicity is founded on the conviction that the gospel is entrusted to the whole church and comes from this representative character. The assembly represents and speaks to the whole church. Because it expresses the faith of the whole church, an ecumenical council is the most authoritative teaching body in a church. Councils are perhaps the most effective way that we have found to discern the mind of the whole church. This process of discernment necessarily involves a dynamic process of dialogue. The bishops gathered in council must attend to the voice of all the faithful in order to discern the living faith of the church. Through conciliar debates, which are often fraught with dissension and difficulty, they learn from the experience of their fellow bishops who come from regions throughout the world, from different ecclesial traditions. Consider how the bishops of the Latin Church learned from the Eastern Catholic bishops who were present at Vatican II. They weigh the contributions of theologians and experts and consider the merits of various approaches and formulations of doctrine. That the conciliar period was a time of intensified dialogue within the Catholic Church is clear when we look back to the number of pastoral letters, monographs, and study aids prepared by individual bishops, groups of religious and laity in this period. Bishops sought to consult with and inform clergy, religious, and the laity of their diocese concerning the orientation and activities of the Council. In the preparatory period leading up to Vatican II, from 1959 to 62, Pope John XXIII invited the entire episcopate, religious superiors, and schools of theology from around the world to submit in writing any and all concerns that might be considered on the Council's agenda. The result of this extensive consultation is contained in 13 volumes, or 7,000 pages of text. The combined acts of the assembly itself, including the many speeches written and written interventions of the bishops over the 4 years from 1962 to 1965, fills another 35 volumes. In all, the corpus of the Acts of Vatican II comprise 52 volumes, a daunting production for any scholar or student of history and theology. For many Catholic bishops, the entire period of the Council was a time of intense study and learning. Maurice Baudou, the Archbishop of Saint-Boniface, Manitoba, and a leading figure in the Canadian Catholic Conference during the Council, was moved to write, "I am relearning many things, or learning them from the first time from my theologians. Given the advances, or at least the new perspectives in the sacred sciences over the past 34 years. He had not studied this much since he left the seminary." And that was his confession to his clergy. The process of learning undertaken by the Council Fathers was an essential component of encounter with the tradition of the gospel in the Church, both in its historical expression and in the living faith of contemporary believers. It was a profoundly transformative experience. Monsignor Baudou doesn't hesitate to speak about experiencing conversion, a profound experience of conversion. So now I come to some of these protagonists and their role in the Council. And the first is John the 23rd, on the purpose of the Council and the form of its teaching. During the period leading up to the official opening of the Council on October 11th, 1962, it's fair to say there were competing visions of what a council ought to be and of how the Church should carry forth its mission in the modern world. There had been 20 ecumenical councils in the history of the Catholic Church. While a number of these were concerned, not unlike Vatican II, with reform and with attempts to restore Christian unity, these are the two principal aims of Vatican II, declared by John the 23rd. Many previous councils were primarily legislative events which produce declarations of censure and condemnations of doctrinal error. Their texts were primarily concerned to correct deviations from received teaching and practice. This is what many expected of the Second Vatican Council. It's perhaps not surprising, then, that the texts brought forth by the bishops, to the bishops by the Preparatory Commission were largely written in this vein. In his official convocation of Vatican II, however, Pope John invited the bishops to what we now recognize as a distinctive style of teaching and of engagement, which would distinguish the Second Vatican Council from previous councils. He insisted that an updating, aggiornamento in his Italian, of the Church was necessary because the world was living through a dramatic period of change. A crisis was underway. Humanity, he said, is at the threshold of a new age, and the Church should be concerned to bring the perennial life-giving energies of the gospel to the modern world. While much important technological and material progress had been made in the early 20th century, he also noted an impoverishment in spiritual life and a growing presence of atheism. Rather than condemn these developments, Pope John preferred to look to the signs of the times, as he called them, for reasons to hope for the future of the Church and of humanity. The destructive power of scientific progress, evidenced in the drama of the two world wars, he said, had, quote, forced human beings to become thoughtful, more aware of their limitations, desirous of peace, alert to the importance of spiritual values. It has accelerated the progress of closer collaboration and the mutual integration of individuals, classes and nations toward which Even amid 1,000 uncertainties, the human family seems to be moving. John the 23rd demonstrated by his own words and actions the compassionate regard for the world that he desired the whole church to have as it reconsidered its life and mission. Where many saw darkness and danger, he called the bishops of the council to recognize reasons for hope. In his opening speech at the council, Pope John made it clear, this council must do more than simply repeat the teachings of the past. The world was waiting for the church to take a bold leap forward. To proclaim the gospel in the modern age, its faith, he said, should be studied and expounded through the methods of research and through the literary forms of modern thought. He carefully distinguished between the perennial substance of faith and the way in which it was presented. The form of the church's faith must be renewed if the council was to achieve what he called its pastoral purpose. Vatican II would indeed be concerned to reaffirm Christian doctrine and to address errors. Yet the bishops would make a conscious decision not to do so by the means of the legislative text or by pronouncing anathemas. For Pope John, the salient point of the council must be to find a way of presenting church doctrine that corresponds to modern ways of thinking. The church would teach by means of inspiration, using a language of charity and mercy rather than condemnation. Similarly, it would call the whole church to carry out its mission and witness through the persuasive language of authentic witness and service to the human community. The council would value dialogue more than confrontation, invitation more than condemnation. In order to renew the church's teaching and practice, the bishops of Vatican II would have to carry out an important balancing act and do the work of both what the French theologians have called ressourcement, returning to the sources of the gospel and the Christian tradition, and aggiornamento, renewing and reforming the church teaching and practice so that it might better communicate that faith tradition to contemporaries. The teaching office of bishops is to maintain the church in the faith of the apostles, those first witnesses to the resurrection of Christ. This entails that twofold task. First, they are to preserve the tradition of the gospel. The second related task is to bring the gospel to life for contemporary people in every new context. The church is called to mediate a timeless truth in a changing social, cultural, and historical context. It was this creative tension that gave birth to a distinctively dialogical style in the teaching of Vatican II. Previous councils may have placed greater emphasis on the conservative function of the bishop's teaching office. In contrast, the bishops at Vatican II were acutely aware of the need to exercise their creative responsibility in speaking to the world. So, on to some other advocates for dialogue. And the first I will mention is Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger, the Cardinal Archbishop of Montreal. In his historic opening address, John the 23rd expressed a view shared by a number of visionary bishops who played important roles in the course of the council. Some had expressed concerns regarding the inadequacy of the approach taken in the draft documents brought forward by the Preparatory Commission. Among them was Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger of Montreal. Léger was a member of the Central Preparatory Commission and witnessed the classing of views of the Council's purpose as they played out there. On the eve of the council, he addressed a now famous letter to John the 23rd with the full support of 6 other cardinals: Joseph Frings of Cologne, Julius Döpfner of Munich, Franz König of Vienna, Leon Joseph Sunens of Mechlin, Brussels, Bernard Alfrink, the Cardinal Archbishop of Utrecht, and Achille Liénard of Lille, all of whom were protagonists in the events that determined the direction of the Council. Expressing his hopes for the Council, Léger noted in his letter that the Pope's personal attitude had already, quote, encouraged a beneficial dialogue among Catholics and modified relationships between Catholics and other Christians in the sense of a greater charity and better understanding. He welcomed the fact that a number of schemas, or draft texts, took a positive and pastoral approach. While affirming the doctrine of the Church and its concerns, they refrained from pronouncing anathemas. Nonetheless, Léger was impelled to share his deep concern that a number of important schemas did not sufficiently reflect the orientation for the Council laid out by Pope John the 23rd. He wrote, this is a long citation, but I think it's worth reconsidering. Several schemas consider the Church too much as an institution under siege, which the Council must defend, to see her, and they fail to see her as a shining custodian of salvation to be shared with others. The Church appears there as more of a juridical than a missionary institution. One dare not turn freely to the contemporary world towards its needs, its new and legitimate demands. On the contrary, one seems to believe that it suffices to repeat with greater insistence formulae to which the world no longer listens, without, however, sounding the doctrine more deeply. One seems to think that the loss of faith, the deterioration of morals, and failings of the apostolate have no other cause but the inattention of men or the evils of the times, without asking whether the abandonment of certain forms of thought or action by the Church might also be a factor. Léger himself had carefully studied the preparatory texts in the summer of 1962 with a small circle of theologians. Their overall evaluation was that without an important change of course, the Council would prove deeply disappointing and risked missing an opportunity to speak to contemporary men and women in a meaningful way. Reacting to the proposed texts, they called for an attitude of sympathy, of openness, of participation in an immense and loyal quest, of a desire to assimilate and to perfect, through the contribution of Christian thought, a whole host of authentic riches. And I'm quoting here from their report. Léger's concern might be summed up in his comment on the schema, on the magisterium of the Church, De Ecclesia Magisterio, where he writes, "It proposes a magisterium of security and of conservation, rather than a magisterium whose primary responsibility is to announce the gospel. It paid no attention to the receivers of the Church's proclamation and witness." A second protagonist, Cardinal Léon Joseph Sunens. Cardinal Sunens of Belgium shared many of the concerns expressed by Cardinal Léger regarding the preparation of the Council. In May of 1962, he prepared a proposal for a broad framework to reorganize the work of the Council and to consolidate the materials contained in the unwieldy collection of 75 texts prepared in advance of the first session. He also proposed a more positive and pastoral approach to their elaboration. The hallmark of Sunen's plan, which he presented to the bishops of the council in aula in the conciliar debates on December 4th of 1962, was the organization of the council's work along two axes. The first being the inner life and nature of the church, or the church ad intra, the center of which would become the dogmatic constitution on the church, the document we call today Lumen Gentium. And the second being the external relations of the church, so to speak, the church ad extra, which would eventually be contained in an entirely new document on the church in the modern world, the document we know today as Gaudium et Spes. This latter text in his plan would contain reflections on the human person, on matters of social justice, on family life, on peace and war. Sunens insisted that the church must engage in a threefold dialogue. First, with her own believing members. Second, with what he called the not yet visibly united other Christians. And third, with the modern world. The ailing Pope John XXIII had carefully studied and approved Sunen's intervention in advance. It would largely guide the reordering of the work of the conciliar commissions in the period between the first and second sessions from January to August of 1963. And the subsequent course of the council, I think you could see, followed these main lines. The third protagonist, Pope Paul VI, a theology of dialogue. Cardinal Sunens had conferred with other leading cardinals in the months prior to his intervention to gain their support for his plan. Among them was Giovanni Battista Montini, the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan. It was Montini, elected as Pope Paul VI in June of 1963, who would articulate the priority of the practice of dialogue for the life of the Church. In the opening days of the Council, Montini had also written to Cardinal Amleto Cicognani of the Vatican Secretariat of State and chairman of the Secretary for Extraordinary Questions at the Council, regarding the need to provide a more organic structure for the agenda of the Council. While Montini, like Sunens, suggested that the reflection on the Church serve as the organizing principle for the Council's deliberation, his vision was decidedly more Christocentric. He proposed that the Council order its work first on the mystery of the Church, including its essential nature and the differing calls of its members, bishops, priests, religious, and laity. Then he suggested that in a subsequent session, the Council could turn its focus to the mission of the Church, and in a third session, to its relationship with the surrounding world. Montini contended that in addressing separated Christians and other religions, and in speaking on matters relating to civil society, contemporary culture, science, and economics, the Church must better adapt its discourse. It must find a more appropriate manner of communicating its message to humanity, a more prophetic style that would resonate with the experience of the wider human community. Cardinal Montini was known to be sympathetic as well to Léger's letter of concern and spoke in support of Sunen's intervention in the Council debate in December of 1962. The activities of all three of these men reveal a sense of apprehension regarding the failure of the early drafts of the conciliar texts to respond to the overarching pastoral intention of John XXIII. Their conviction, soon embraced by the Council itself, was that a more suitable mode of teaching and of pastoral engagement was required if the Church was to be an effective witness to the gospel in the modern world. When Cardinal Montini was elected to succeed Pope John XXIII, he proposed that the language and practice of dialogue become the leitmotif of the Council. His reflections are contained on this topic. His reflections are contained in the first and much neglected encyclical of his pontificate, Ecclesiam Suam, on the ways in which the Church is to carry out its mission. Pope Paul's programmatic letter set out the priorities of his ministry and gave a sure direction to the Council, building on the firm foundation laid by his predecessor. His plan was intended to assist the Church to better place itself at the service of society. Pope Paul's threefold plan for the Second Vatican Council and for the subsequent activity of the Church entailed, first, a deeper self-understanding of the Church, in particular of its nature and mission. A heightened consciousness of the identity of the Church must include an understanding of its rootedness in Christ, with a healthy realism about the dissonance between the ideal image of the Church intended by Christ and the actual image presented by the community of believers in the world today. This honest and humble self-examination, he wrote, must lead the Church to the second element of his blueprint, a commitment to undertake whatever reforms deemed necessary for the renewal of its life and witness. The work of metanoia, or conversion, which he uses this word in his letter, was not only to be a principal feature of the Council's task of updating the Church. The ongoing renewal of the pilgrim Church must become a permanent concern as she grows in her understanding of the gospel and in fidelity to its message. The third course of action in Pope Paul VI's overarching vision is dialogue, friendly dialogue. His words. He considered the most serious and complex problem confronting the Church to be, quote, the Church's dialogue with the modern world, unquote. Pope Paul affirmed that the Church, while it possessed a unique calling and did not share uncritically in all the values of modernity, nonetheless belongs to and is deeply rooted in the world. It must adopt an attitude of dialogical engagement, he insisted, if it is to fulfill its mission to, quote, bring people together in mutual love through the power that the kingdom of justice and peace which Christ inaugurated by his coming into the world, unquote. The Church cannot be indifferent to, afraid of, or contemptuous of the world, but must come closer to it. For Paul VI, dialogue is synonymous with charity. He argued that dialogue is required by the changing face of modern society, including the experience of pluralism and the growing consciousness of the basic dignity of the human person. Pope Paul and the Council Fathers recognized that if the Church is to engage with the modern world, it must speak in a manner that is clear and intelligible. To be effective teachers and witnesses, they would have to examine closely the kind of speech they use. They would have to ask themselves, is it easy to understand? Can it be grasped by ordinary people? Is it current idiom? These kinds of questions are no less significant today. It's really worth rereading his letter. Looking back, these questions allow us to comprehend the motives that led the bishops of Vatican II to adopt the distinctive style of teaching and pastoral practices that they did. The predominant motive for engaging in dialogue, however, if we follow Pope Paul's teaching, is much more than a desire to practice effective methods of communication. Pope Paul underlines that, quote, "the noble origin of dialogue is in the mind of God," unquote. Indeed, the whole history of salvation and of God's revelation is a conversation initiated by God, who has spoken a definitive and self-revealing word of love for all humanity in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The mystery of the divine Trinity is itself a mystery of self-giving and trustful dialogue. Words of Paul VI again. Trustful dialogue among the three divine persons. Through baptism, we are drawn into the life-giving dynamic of this conversation, which is renewed each time we listen to God's words proclaimed in Scripture or open our hearts in prayer. The exchange of dialogue is a reflection of the inner nature of the Church, which exists to serve as an instrument of God's dialogue of salvation with all humanity. At bottom, dialogue, again in the words of Paul VI, is a way of making spiritual contact. Pope Paul's vision of the Church in dialogue extends out in a series of concentric circles to embrace all of humanity, including non-believers, other religions, other Christians, and members of the Catholic communion of churches. Dialogue is to become the fundamental disposition that underpins every aspect of the Church's life and mission. A man given to symbolic gestures, Paul VI himself gave an example of the Church's commitment to dialogue in the 3 historical pilgrimages he undertook during the Council. First, to the Holy Land in January of 1964, where he met with the ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople. Also, while in the Holy Land, he met with Jewish leaders. Second, to India, the cradle of great religions, in December of 1964, where he wept with the poor and the sick as a simple pilgrim. And thirdly, to New York, where in October 1965, he addressed a special assembly of the United Nations, expressing the commitment of the Catholic Church to work with all peoples for the promotion of justice and peace. He was the first pope to venture outside of Italy since the 19th century. In his encyclical, Pope Paul VI was able to articulate the emerging consensus of the Council Fathers concerning the basic form of the Council's teaching and their conviction regarding the necessity to renew the ways of being church. This clarification of the Council's purpose, its style of teaching, and its conception of the mission of the Church represents an historic turning point in the relationship of the Church to the modern world. This was a community still deeply traumatized and isolated by a succession of violent shocks in the 18th and 19th centuries, beginning from the French Revolution and continuing through the German Kulturkampf and the Italian Risorgimento. The emergence of the modern nation-state was accompanied by often harsh measures aimed at ending the long and tumultuous marriage between church and state. The Church's fear and suspicion of modern ideas had manifested itself within the Catholic Church in the modernist crisis of the early 20th century. Remarkably, Vatican II now invited Catholics to end a long estrangement and turn toward all people of goodwill in solidarity, friendship, and collaboration. My next point is dialogue in the teaching of Vatican II. John O'Malley has helpfully drawn our attention to the literary genre that distinguishes the 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council from the style of teaching characteristic of previous ecumenical councils. He argues convincingly that to understand the Council's teaching, we must attend to both what the Council said and to how it said it, or the form of its teaching. The Council, he explains, adopted an epideictic form of discourse, in contrast to the controversial or polemical style that had characterized much of Catholic theology and teaching, especially since the Protestant Reformation. This panegyric style recalls the rhetorical style of the great Greek and Roman classics and the discourse of many early church fathers. It paints an idealized portrait in an effort to inspire and incite emulation, to reach the human heart and move it to action. O'Malley observes that this new style of discourse required the acquisition of a new vocabulary, including the use of horizontal words, as he describes them. In its description of relationships, relationships within the church, we find terms such as brother or sister and people of God. We have reciprocity words such as cooperation, partnership, and collaboration. O'Malley notes the frequent use of reciprocity or friendship words such as the human family, and humility words such as pilgrim people. Among the two most important words, O'Malley notes the terms collegiality and dialogue. He writes, "Dialogue manifests a radical shift from the prophetic "I say unto you" style that had earlier prevailed and indicates something other than unilateral decision-making." He observes further, there is scarcely a page in the Council documents on which dialogue or its equivalent does not occur. In fact, the term dialogue appears 28 times in the corpus of Council texts, 12 times in the decree on ecumenism, 6 times in the decree on the missionary activity of the Church, 6 times in the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, twice in the Declaration on Christian Education, and once each in the Declaration on Religious Freedom and the decree on the training of priests. When we read these documents, it becomes immediately apparent that the Council's style of teaching was not only aimed at engaging listeners within the Church. Dialogue is to become the hallmark of the Church's engagement with other Christians, with other religions, and with contemporary society. It is to be a distinguishing feature of relationships both within the Church, ad intra, and with those beyond the institutional boundaries of the Catholic Church, ad extra. So I want to just briefly go through some of the main lines of this work, this theme in Council texts, following the structure of the concentric circles set out by Pope Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suam. And the first of these is dialogue with humanity. Paul VI taught that true dialogue, founded on the principles of respect for human rights and the dignity of the human person, eschews all means of coercion and does not have conversion to the Christian faith as its immediate object. It seeks to affirm all that is good and true in the social, cultural, and religious convictions of others without prejudice. The Second Vatican Council embraced these very principles in its Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, without which commitment to dialogue with peoples of other faith, with other Christians, or with non-believers would have little or no credibility. While the Decree on Religious Liberty affirms the right of every person to follow the dictates of their conscience, it also recognizes the responsibility of all to seek the truth. Dignitatis Humanae provides a clue to understanding the role of dialogue in the pursuit of truth when it states, and I quote, "Truth, however, is to be sought after in a manner proper to the dignity of the human person and his or her social nature. The inquiry is to be free, carried on with the aid of teaching or instruction, communication, and dialogue, in the course of which people explain to one another the truth they have discovered or think they have discovered in order to assist one another in the quest for truth." Authentic dialogue, then, is neither a strategy susceptible to relativism nor a ploy to impose one's points of view. At bottom, it is a common search for truth. The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World finds the basis for dialogue with all peoples in the dignity of human persons and in the social character of human existence. It calls not only to engage with those who share our point of view, but also for love and respect for those with differing views. Dialogue is a mutual exchange. While the Church has a message to share with humanity, it is also called to listen and to learn. The Council's decree on the missionary activity of the Church, Ad Gentes, invites us to learn from the nations what treasures a generous God has placed there in Article 11. Similarly, Gaudium et Spes in Article 44 affirms, and I quote, "The Church herself knows how richly she has profited by the history and development of humanity. The experience of past ages, the progress of the sciences, and the treasures hidden in the various forms of human culture, by all of which the nature of humanity is more clearly revealed and new roads to truth are opened, these profit the Church too." Vatican II saw the presence of atheism as one of the most serious challenges of the late 20th century. In the context of the 1960s, the presence and power of atheism were felt most acutely in Central and Eastern Europe, then under communist rule. Eastern Catholics suffered considerable oppression, I understate my case, under the Soviet regime, and dialogue hardly seemed possible. And Pope Paul VI in his encyclical has a long excursus about this. Nonetheless, Gaudium et Spes would invite us to understand the motives of modern atheists, and in particular, to consider how objectionable forms of Church's teaching and practice might give reasons to those who find it impossible to believe in the gospel. I quote from Gaudium et Spes, number 19. "For taken as a whole, atheism is not a spontaneous development, but stems from a variety of causes, including a critical reaction against religious beliefs, and in some places, against the Christian religion in particular. Hence, believers can have no more than a little to do with the birth of atheism. To the extent that they neglect their own training in the faith, or teach erroneous doctrine, or are deficient in their religious, moral, and social life, they must be said to conceal rather than reveal the authentic face of God and religion," unquote. worth repeating today in today's context, about which I will say more in a moment. So the next concentric circle, dialogue with other religions. As I noted in the outset of this paper, it's become fashionable to speak of the culture of dialogue, which is to characterize interreligious relations today. The Second Vatican Council's decree on non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, while it never employs the term dialogue in the Latin version, you will find it in English translations, uses synonyms to exhort us to conversation with other religions so that we might collaborate with them in the promotion of common spiritual, moral, and cultural values. It invites us in particular to engage in formal study and conversations with representatives of the Jewish faith in order that we might better understand, grow in a better understanding of the shared patrimony of Christianity and Judaism. We are urged to affirm that we all share with other religious traditions. We are urged to affirm all that we share with other religious traditions. For, in Article 2, it is stated, the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions and seeks to promote all the positive values found in them. The decree on the missionary activity of the Church underlines the importance of engagement in dialogue with other religions and cultures, calling for the formation of priests and catechists in an ecumenical spirit and in the habits of dialogue with non-Christians. The next concentric circle, dialogue with other Christians. The most fully developed reflection on the actual process of dialogue in the Council's teaching appears in the decree on ecumenism. Significantly, here, dialogue is linked explicitly to the other two elements of Pope Paul's program, humble self-examination and reform. The decree tells us that through dialogue, everyone gains a truer knowledge and more just appreciation of the teaching and religious life of both communions. So here we're talking about dialogue between representatives of two churches. But what is said here implies that dialogue is a means to help each church gain a deeper understanding, not only of our dialogue partner, but also of our own ecclesial identity. The process of dialogue seeks to acknowledge and esteem the truly Christian endowments from our common heritage present in other churches. Further, it should lead Catholics to carefully examine themselves and undertake whatever reform and renewal is required to be more faithful to the gospel. This is in Article 4 of the Decree on Ecumenism. We, Catholics, must be the first to remove any obstacles to unity that may be found in our own way of living, even in the manner of the Church's teaching. Article 11. The Decree on Ecumenism further recognizes that because we are a pilgrim community of redeemed sinners, the task of reform is a continual process. The next concentric circle, dialogue in the Church. We find perhaps the strongest exhortation to dialogue within the Church in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. Again, it's worth citing at length here because it links the practice of dialogue to the heart of the Church's calling. I'm citing from Article 92 of Gaudium et Spes. By virtue of her mission to shed on the whole world the radiance of the gospel message and to unify under one spirit all people of whatever nation, race, or culture, the Church stands forth as a sign of that fellowship which allows honest dialogue and gives it vigor. Such a mission requires, in the first place, that we foster within the Church herself mutual esteem, reverence, and harmony through the full recognition of lawful diversity. Thus, all those who compose the one people of God, both pastors and the general faithful, can engage in dialogue with ever-abounding fruitfulness. For the bounds of unity, the bounds which unite the faithful, are mightier than anything dividing them. I'd like to meditate on this late at night. This text, I think, needs to be read against the background of Lumen Gentium's insistence that the Church is to be a sign and a sacrament of the unity and communion that God intends for all humanity, in the first article of Lumen Gentium. In other words, if the Church wishes to promote dialogue and unity among the nations, its inner life must be a model of that dynamic exchange which nourishes communion. The Second Vatican Council wished to foster a renewal of traditional synodal structures and encourage the development of new ones in order to facilitate this dialogue in the Church. Among them, it mentions, and I'll go through these very quickly, the Synod of Bishops, the International Synod of Bishops, regional conferences of bishops, and the patriarchal synods of the Eastern Catholic Churches, intended to promote a more collegial exercise of episcopal authority. The Council calls for the practice of, for the renewed and ancient practice of holding more frequent particular councils in each ecclesiastical province or within the territory of each conference of bishops. These are found in Christus Dominus, the decree on the pastoral office of bishops. At the Diocesan Council, the Council supports the traditional practice of holding regular diocesan synods, the role of presbyteral councils and a college of consultors, and encourages the establishment of a permanent pastoral council whenever possible in each diocese, so that qualified representatives of the local church, ordained religious and laity, might work collaboratively with the bishop to determine the pastoral needs and priorities of the diocese. The ecclesiology that underpins these initiatives extends to the level of the parish, where the parish pastoral council provides a forum for shared reflection and collaboration in parish pastoral planning. All of these structures are intended to be spaces of that honest dialogue where together we might continue to discern the demands of gospel living and shape the Church's mission in the service of the human family. So I come to my last section, which are some free reflections on dialogue in the Church today. Much has transpired since the close of the Second Vatican Council almost 50 years ago. That efforts have been made to live out the challenge of the Council's teaching and to undertake serious reform is clearly evident when we examine the developments in Catholic social teaching, initiatives in interfaith dialogue, and the significant progress achieved through officially mandated dialogue between the churches. My own engagement in ecumenical work has convinced me that the Catholic Church has invested perhaps more than any other single church in the past 50 years to organize and support officially mandated dialogue with both the representatives of other religions and other Christian churches. The fact that the magnitude and importance of this effort remains largely unknown to many Catholics today is perhaps less an indication of their effectiveness than of a certain breakdown in communication or a failure to educate members of our own church regarding advances in overcoming many differences once thought to be church dividing. The principal weaknesses we have encountered those of us who work in ecumenical dialogues, is that the fruits of these conversations are not adequately linked to that process, that continual process of self-examination and ongoing reform that Pope Paul VI considered as forming an essential part of the direction of the Council and of the Church's pastoral life in the modern world. The next steps toward the reconciliation of the churches will require a deeper and more honest introspection on the part of the Catholic Church and further concrete reform, including greater collegiality in church governance, increased freedom for the enculturation of pastoral practice in the local churches, rethinking the adequacy of ministerial structures, and greater recognition and integration of the gifts of the laity. The worldwide Catholic population is now twice what it was in 1962. The largest Catholic communities are found today in Brazil, the Philippines, and Mexico. Fully 2/3 of the Catholic population now resides south of the equator. Never in the history of the Church have we experienced such a rapid and dramatic demographic and cultural shift than in the last 50 years. We may rightfully ask whether the renewal of ecclesial structures begun at Vatican II has kept pace with these developments, and consider, to better support the communion of the local churches or the growing demands of diocesan and parish life, what new adaptations might be required in our day. Society is far more pluralistic today than it was 50 years ago, thanks to an unprecedented migration of peoples. Religious conflict regularly makes the headline news. If we are to equip the next generation of Catholics to live the gospel in such a world, we must take more seriously the challenge of forming men and women of dialogue and openness, who are at once firmly rooted in the rich Catholic tradition and open to the recognition of small c Catholicity in the many gifts that God has bestowed upon other Christians or entrusted to other religious traditions. The Council exhorts Catholic schools to aid, quote, the fulfillment of the mission of the people of God and to the fostering of the dialogue between the Church and humankind to the benefit of both. It's a little line in the Decree on Religious Christian Education. Surely, this is the goal of all Christian formation, beginning in our families and parishes and extending to adult faith formation, seminary, and university education. We must give a high priority to forming new generations capable of sincere dialogue with other Christians and members of other religious traditions. In a world where relationships between us are too often polarized by currents of fundamentalism or by persistent ignorance and the added distortion of the media, we need bridge builders, agents of mutual understanding, of reconciliation and peace. The problem of atheism that the Second Vatican Council sought to address, then symbolized by the atheistic states of Eastern Europe, has spread rapidly in recent decades. Today, it is estimated that 20% of North Americans claim no religious affiliation. Read Reg Bibby. Now, no less than half a century ago, it's worth considering the Council's invitation to understand the motives of atheism. As the relationship between the secular state and religious communities continues to evolve at an accelerated pace, we need to think creatively and intentionally about how to engage in a constructive dialogue concerning the rightful place and value of religious communities in contemporary society. While at the level of international and national and international levels, the Catholic Church has committed important resources to certain institutionalized structures for dialogue with those outside the Church. The majority of ordinary Catholics do not experience themselves as implicated in such a project. What is more, few see themselves as participants in a conversation that is of any consequence for the life of their parish or diocese. They search in vain for spaces where they can share their concerns and contribute their gifts to the mission of the Church. The creative potential of the diocesan synod or pastoral councils, if and where they have been implemented, remain largely unexploited. For the past 15 years, I've studied with other scholars the structural renewal engendered by the Council and the provisions for these structures in the Code of Canon Law. We have repeatedly concluded that there's no lack of provision for structures of dialogue within the Church. Their actual execution, however, is often half-hearted or non-existent. There is much work to be done before we can say that the culture of dialogue has really taken root within our local churches. If the inner life of the Church, a communion of all the baptized, is to model the dialogical exchange we desire to stimulate in the service of the human family, then we've only begun to undertake the kind of renewal in the pastoral life of the Church envisioned by Vatican II. It is vital for the future of the Church and the very credibility of its witness in the world that the next generation of Catholics be formed in and through a lively experience of dialogue within our communities. Like the bishops who took part in the Second Vatican Council, they will be transformed by this encounter and desire to contribute more to the creative synergy of our common witness in the world. Only through that experience of authentic encounter and dialogue with Christ and with others will they grow towards a deeper understanding of their own identity and calling and of the vocation of the whole Church. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We now have about 10 minutes for dialogue with Kathy.
I promise to listen.
May I ask a question, please? You talk about culture of dialogue and friendly dialogue. All of this aids our understanding of other religions. My understanding of Islam says very, very clearly in the Quran that Jesus was never crucified and didn't die for our sins. That's so categorical and such a fundamental rejection of the basis of our faith. How do you go further than that in dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is an important question. I think the question even of understanding the Quran is a very lively question for members of the Islamic community today. And that there are different streams of Islam, some of whom are open to dialogue and conversation, and some who are not. In my experience, there are many members of the of the Muslim community that are quite interested in dialogue with Christians and with members of the Church. We have experiences here in Canada, very positive experiences of religious leaders working together for issues of common social concern. So there is a basic understanding of some common values, some common human values. And I think this is possible even without asking others to accept our basic conviction about the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. So we start at that basic human level.
Thank you, Catherine. You put it together very well in telescope the whole thing. For me, I want to just go one step beyond where you were and then ask you a question about it. And it seems that what you're coming to, even at the parish level, because you just cited that a little while ago, is what dialogue really had come to mean during Vatican II, even in the run-up to it, where Leger and the other protagonists must have been really confounding them what they were getting. Somehow or other they managed to shift everything around 62. My question is this, that what we're hearing a lot about now is a phrase called the new evangelization. And what it seems to me to mean, perhaps not the way the Church seems to have intended it, but the way in which it's being appliqué is we're going to take you all. None of you really know anything. We're going to take you all back to zero, start from scratch. None of you have a spiritual life. We're going to take you right back to zero, and we're going to tell you what and how. And that's what it seems in the applied sense, that's what it's come to mean. In other words, totally no dialogue. And I'm wondering, what is your take on that? Thanks.
Thank you.
Not whether it's recommended, just
Yeah.
how do you see that?
Well, I'm going to defer, especially to my colleague this afternoon. Professor Routier will say much more about the new evangelization. But in my sense is that the way of carrying out the new evangelization has to be informed by this dialogical engagement. And I don't see another way to go about it. It's not about imposing our views on others. Within the Church, I think we have to continue to be discerning together. A part of my fear in some of the zeal that I see people embracing this watchword of the new evangelization is that we tend to be perhaps replacing an education in the broadest culture of our tradition with forms of piety that don't go very deep. And I think we have to be alert to that and say, piety is not a negative thing. It's a real reflection of people's devotion and spirituality, but it has to be informed by a broader culture and knowledge of our tradition and faith. And my fear is that we might be lacking that. I think Father Theobald said something similar last evening, that we're missing that the kind of faith formation that is really required for Christians in our culture today requires much more of us than inviting people to march lockstep through a set of spiritual exercises.
Douglas Daniel, Sherbrooke. I want to thank you for stressing the importance, the content of Ecclesiam Suam. In my view, it's the most neglected document of the Church, hardly quoted in any other document that comes out of Rome. As far as I know, it's not even quoted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And I think this is indicative of an attitude towards dialogue that is prevalent in some quarters of the Church. And thank you for stressing it. I urge anybody, if they can find a copy of the document,
Yes.
c'est le document le plus signifiant de l'époque de Paul VI et doit être lu et médité.
Thank you. I agree. That's why I wanted to use it. And as an ecumenist, I'm often, I'm one of those people that's suspected as being a relativist or being too soft on doctrine. And one of the reasons I think it's important to go back and understand really what the Council means by its use of this term dialogue. Dialogue is not soft. It's not bargaining away the truth. It's exactly the opposite. And so that's part of my reason for wanting to underline it. So I agree, by all means, we should reopen the text and meditate on it some more in our present context.
Ray Timmerman. I'm a Catholic, married to an Anglican, and so in that canonical structure known as mixed marriages. But because we worship together and serve together in both churches, so we have a Catholic and an Anglican bishop, we are more perhaps appropriately called interchurch families, which comprise 25 to 50% of the marriages in Canada today. Our life is a life of dialogue, discovering in each other's churches and through each other's eyes in our own churches the riches that are found there. We have been called by Pope Benedict XVI a laboratory of Christian unity. The lack of dialogue in the church impacts us 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, especially at the time of the sacrament of unity, where we must either, it seems, shall I say, deny our unity in marriage, no, deny the unity of the sacrament, or deny the unity of our marriage in order to be able to receive and thereby immediately disqualify us from receiving. My question for you is, do you see any ways in which the gift of dialogue and of unity, which we struggle to live, however imperfectly, may be recognized and celebrated in the church as a gift rather than a problem?
Thank you. I think this is a very important question and a very important example of some of the neglected resources in the experience of many of our own fellow Christians. I teach often courses on ecumenism, and when I'm with students, I try and underline how important the experience of interchurch couples and interchurch families is. Most pastors, I think, don't even realize how many interchurch families are present in the pews every Sunday. And anyone engaged in pastoral ministry in this country knows that you cannot attend a funeral, a wedding, a service, a liturgy where there are not other Christians present. So I think, and I agree with you, we need a more concerted effort to listen to the experience of interchurch families so that we can understand better. In many ways, you live, you know, from the interchurch family movement as a domestic church in your own family, and you experience the unity that our churches haven't found a way to live yet. And we need to listen to your experience as a resource that can inform our practice. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clifford, for a most thought-provoking paper in which you show how the culture of dialogue is rooted in the Second Vatican Council. And particularly I found was the role of Paul VI and how very much he is the one who, well, he anyways gave it a great impetus, and the theological foundation that he gave in God himself and the dialogue in God and revelation to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.